Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction. I'm so glad to be here. I told some of you we had a little mishap this morning. I got a text early this morning from Delta Airlines saying that our flight was delayed. We couldn't make the connection in Atlanta, and I thought we were going to have to back out of the whole thing. American Airlines came to the rescue, and here we are. Very glad to be here. Thanks to Angie Maxwell for organizing this, and to Nikolai DePipa, who did such a wonderful job in hosting us and getting us here. Civil War historiography has produced just a mountain of scholarship on the Civil War era. There's no end to it. It's been our national obsession for 150 years, and no sign of dying down. David Potter, famous historian of the South, once complained that the Civil War has been the subject of our worst navel-gazing, that historians seem to think of it as our war, and that the rest of the world had absolutely no role in it or didn't care about it. This is America's war, fought by America's soldiers on American soil about issues that were peculiarly American in origin and with ramifications that were limited primarily to the United States. For a long time, the narrative was devoted to this reconciliation theme, that this was a brothers' war between people who shared a common language and religion and national heritage, and that it was an unnecessary, tragic war caused by unnecessary divisions between the sections over issues that should have been resolved were it not for the fanatical zealots on each side and the blundering politicians who failed to compromise these issues. And then in the 1960s, historians really began to bring forward the issue that had been veiled in that reconciliation narrative: slavery, race, and America's reluctant reckoning with the problems of slavery and race. Now it became the unfinished revolution, the prelude to the American Civil Rights Movement. Much of it was being written in the shadow of the current American Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s and 1970s. This has been one of the richest and most fruitful areas of American history writing. There's a huge audience for the books on the Civil War. But even as it became more relevant and more substantive in its approach to what really caused the war and what it meant to us, it became even more bound by the national narrative, and except for some diplomatic historians, pretty much limited to the United States: North, South, Lincoln, Davis, Grant, Lee, and the home front, and other subjects, but always within this nationally bound narrative. What I wanted to do was to step outside the nation, to look at what the world, how the world viewed this American crisis, and often to see it through foreign eyes, through foreign intellectuals, politicians, foreign journalists, but also through the foreign soldiers who played such an important role in fighting this war, especially for the Union side. One of the first things I discovered was that our war, our American Civil War, really mattered to the rest of the world. They were following it in the newspapers, they were following it in political debates, they were referring to it, they followed the battles. At the end of the war, when Lincoln died, and hundreds, indeed about 1,000 letters of condolence, resolutions of sympathy came in from different parts of the world to U.S. legations around the world. It was clear that all this time during these 4 years that they were following the war. They knew the story of Lincoln's life, the rail splitter, Honest Abe, and so on. Even in tiny villages down in Sicily, it was amazing how close they were to this war. Why? What did it mean to them? Of course, there were tremendous economic interests at stake. 80% of the world's cotton supply came out of the American South. Not just England, but France, Belgium, many other parts of Europe depended on cotton to employ thousands, huge segments of their workforce, and they were concerned that millions of people would be either on short rations or completely unemployed. There would be cotton famine, and not just a loss of profits and wages, but social unrest in Britain and in Northern Europe. But more than that, it seemed that what they were really caught up in was the ideological struggle, and what this meant for something they called the Republican experiment, this idea that had been born in the late 18th century or reborn in the modern world, that people could govern themselves, that citizens could be the sovereigns, and that they could elect their own government and live by a constitution. There was a prevalent idea, even among many liberal-minded people in Europe and in Latin America, that democracy, or popular government as they called it, simply didn't work, that sooner or later it would descend into despotism or anarchy. And the so-called Great Republic, as its admirers called it, now was proving the point that after electing governments since 1789, when the Constitution was ratified, now finally the Great Republic was on its knees and tearing each other apart. A lot of conservatives in Europe were delighted to see this. It proved their point. Democracy doesn't work. Republican experiment had been pretty much defeated in Europe. Switzerland was the only republic of any size. And since the French Revolution, conservatives were convinced this was a bad idea, and they were glad to see it defeated now in America, which had been held up as the Great Republic, a kind of model for the idea that people could live together peacefully and in prosperity under a popular government. Tory MP Sir John Ramsden in Parliament said that what they were witnessing was the bursting of that great Republican bubble, which had been so often held up to us in England as the model on which to recast our own Constitution. The first duty of British government, Ramsden said, ought to be to strengthen the great distinction between the safe and rational and tempered liberties of England and the wild and unreflecting excesses of mob rule, which had too often desecrated freedom and outraged humanity in America. The Earl of Shrewsbury, another Tory, met with his constituents and told them that what they were seeing across the Atlantic was democracy running amok in America and doomed to its ultimate failure. In America, they saw democracy on its trial, and they saw how it failed. Those before me, the Earl of Shrewsbury said, will see before the end of their lives America and all of the troubled Spanish-American republics return to monarchy or some form of aristocratic rule. In Madrid, very conservative Catholic country, of course, El Pensamiento Español summarized the same kind of indictment, and it mocked the so-called model republic founded in rebellion and atheism, populated by the dregs of all the nations in the world, and living without law of God or man. Now America's republic stood doomed to die in a flood of blood and mire and serve as a rebuke to the flaming theories of democracy. In front of the French legislature, another critic, Achille Foul, said, "Your republic is dead, and it is probably the last the world will see. You will have a reign of terror and then 2 or 3 monarchies. You'll be like Europe. You'll be like France, in other words." Now, European governments did not wait for the Republican experiment just to cave in. They leapt to the opportunity to start carving up the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine now was toothless, with America paralyzed by the secession crisis. And even before the guns at Fort Sumter fired, Spain invaded the Dominican Republic and took back its former colony and annexed it into the Spanish Empire. Many thought they would reintroduce slavery there. They also picked fights in Peru and Chile, and it looked like Spain was trying to recover its lost empire, now unprotected by any kind of American threat. In October 1861, now that the war was clearly going to be a long, sustained war in North America, Spain, France, and Britain met in London and formed the Tripartite Alliance and cooked up a scheme to invade Mexico, which had recently elected a liberal Republican government, now under the leadership of Benito Juarez. And under the pretense of recovering debts, they invaded in December. They denounced the government of Juarez. Spain first, and then Britain pulled out, but France stayed. And their idea was regime change and the installation in Mexico of a monarch from Europe and to restore monarchical order and Catholic authority, not just in Mexico, but over the entire Latin race, as Napoleon III called it in the New World. The idea was that the Latin race was in a struggle with the Teutonic or Anglo-Saxon races in the Old World and the New, and that Maximilian would create a kind of bulwark against the forces, the insidious forces of Anglo-Saxon republicanism. And there was a vast plan, not just to take over Mexico, but to control what he called the Crimea of the New World and to open a canal between the Pacific and the Atlantic and to control a two-ocean empire that had just extended into Indochina, or Vietnam, as we would later know it, in the French Empire. He also had plans for his younger brother to marry the princess of Dom Pedro, the emperor of Brazil, so that this would span also the Portuguese portion of Latin America. Now, in December 1861, also the British sent over 10,000 troops, supposedly to defend Canada, which they were concerned that the United States was going to invade and take over. But it was a menacing presence to the north of the United States as well. Now, this idea that the American Civil War was a trial for democracy and a kind of showdown, epic battle between the forces of republicanism and monarchy, it was invented by the conservatives. That is, it was first introduced by conservative critics of the Republican experiment. Initially, defenders of the Union said, no, that's not what this is about. This is just a war. We're going to resolve it, and it is not a trial. Later, they began to embrace this idea. A lot of European liberals who defended the Union started talking about it as an epic battle that would determine the future of popular government as well as slavery. Karl Marx, radical exile in London, author of the Communist Manifesto, working by day on his famous book, Das Kapital. He paid his rent by writing for the New York Daily Tribune and interpreted European opinion for American readers. The first grand war of contemporaneous history is the American War, Marx announced to Tribune readers in September 1861. The highest form of popular self-government till now realized is giving battle to the meanest and most shameless form of man's enslaving recorded in the annals of history. Edouard Laboulaye, a history professor in the Collège de France, and the leading expert in Europe on American constitutional history, he had been intimidated under the Second Empire of Napoleon III and had retreated into lectures on Roman law. One of his colleagues had gotten denied tenure and fired from the college. Now, as the crisis mounted in America, he decided he would return to his love, America, and to speak up for the Union and to instruct the French that they had a lot at stake in America's future too. The American question gave Laboulaye a chance to talk about France's future as well. The world is a solidarity, he wrote in 1864. The cause of America is the cause of liberty. So long as there shall be across the Atlantic a society of 30 millions of men living happily and peacefully under a government of their choice, with laws made by themselves, liberty will cast her rays over Europe like an illuminating pharos. But should liberty become eclipsed in the New World, it would become night in Europe. Ramon Castilla, the Republican president of Peru, predicted that all of Latin America was about to be caught up in a war between the liberty caps, remember the French revolutionary symbol of liberty, and the crowns. So the Union, instead of repudiating the idea that democracy was on trial, began to embrace this early on. Lincoln and his Secretary of State, William Seward, adopt what they didn't call it this at the time, but they begin to adopt a kind of tactic of soft power by which, instead of trying to tell foreign governments and foreign publics, here is what we stand for, this is the truth, listen to us, tried to align their interests with those of foreign powers and to show how their cause was our cause and that much of their interests were at stake. This is a war that took place in the midst of a burgeoning mass circulation newspapers and journals, rapid communications, telegraphs that spanned continents. At this time, the telegraph connecting Europe and the United States had been laid in 1861, but it broke, and it wouldn't be completed and working until 1866. It might have brought vast changes to diplomacy during the war. But as it was, news flashed very quickly across land in Europe, all the way deep into Asia, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and of course across the United States, not as quickly to the south, into Latin America. It was the internet of our day. And news was copied quickly, and as fast as the telegraph agents could tap out the news, it sped across the land. And then, of course, fast steamships, mail carriers carried news across the Atlantic. Now in 10 or 11 days, sleek ships with coal-burning, steam-powered engines. And there was, in addition, the development of the idea that there was something called a public mind. They refer to it all the time. Lincoln was very adept at this, and I think that people schooled in democracy, in democratic politics, were more accustomed to working with the public mind. And we'll see that a lot of the experts in this undiscovered art or newly developing art of public diplomacy and soft power were newspaper men and politicians who knew how to kind of put the public mind in the right direction, as they put it. By public diplomacy, I mean state-sponsored, deliberate programs aimed at influencing public opinion. Most diplomatic historians say that this doesn't begin until World War I, and that it really doesn't fully flower until the Cold War. Cultural diplomacy, any of you who've been involved in Fulbright programs such as I have been, are very grateful for public diplomacy in Cold War America. It was the idea that you would send professors out and students and have exchanges and influence the public by a kind of demonstration of American values instead of propaganda. William Seward, Lincoln, and Seward's corps of diplomats helped to kind of pioneer this art of public diplomacy. But Southerners also quickly followed. They didn't lead, but they quickly caught up with this idea that we've got to win this war of ideas. This war, I call it the war of ink and ideas beyond the war of blood and bullets at home. William Seward is often used as a kind of foil against Lincoln, the sagacious, calm-mannered, wise, fatherly Lincoln, and Seward, the impulsive, kind of bellicose, cigar-smoking, heavy-drinking warmonger. But Seward and Lincoln worked very closely together, and Seward was A lot of the other diplomats thought he was a little crazy, but I always think he was crazy like a fox. He knew what he was doing, and he knew how to threaten the European world just enough to make them worry. He used to light a cigar. He'd bring diplomats and journalists in, and with a drink at hand, light a cigar, letting the match kind of burn a long time, and fill the room with smoke, and then talk about how if any foreign nation dares to interfere with this domestic rebellion, we will wrap the world in fire. This will be a war of the continents, a war of worlds. And the British and French diplomats said, he may be crazy, but we're worried for that very reason. They've got 1 million men in arms and a huge navy that was growing by the day. And Britain had been involved in 2 wars with the United States, and neither one of them came out real well. But what Seward also learned, one of his early experiments was to send over speakers. And it was interesting. He sent over a Catholic Archbishop, John Hughes, from New York, Irish immigrant, an Episcopalian in England, they call him the Anglican clergyman, Charles McIlvaine, and along with Thurlow Weed. And Thurlow Weed was kind of one of these old hands in New York, a newspaper man, a political operative. And they went over along with General Winfield Scott, this retired, heavy-set, gout-ridden general who was very well known. And this troop, which we now know were sponsored by Seward with money, kind of under the table, all with plausible denial that they were just on a private speaking tour to help the Union cause. They arrived in Europe just in time to help defuse the Trent Crisis. Remember when Britain almost went to war with the United States after the Union had apprehended 2 Confederate diplomats, Slidell and Mason. Later, Henry Ward Beecher was sent over, and a whole troop of others to speak, to get their words in the press and to influence public opinion in these roundabout ways. But Seward had this idea that you would reach them through the pulpit or through their religious values, which was an interesting experiment. But one of the other things that Union diplomats abroad learned was that instead of just trying to write our own articles or to publish pamphlets and so on that they had done, or give our speeches, to enlist native authors, to get journalists, intellectuals, to write their views in their own idiom about why the Union's cause was worth defending. Laboulaye was one of them, but there were many others. Another dissident French man in exile in Switzerland, Agénor Gasparine, wrote a book called The Uprising of a Great People just before the war was even begun. And what he remarked was that the United States isn't falling apart, it's rising up. It has finally confronted the slavery issue, and this is a time for its friends to rally around it. We need hope, they need support, let's give it to them. A young woman by the name of Mary Louise Booth up in New York translated this book within a week, and it became one of the strongest messages of Europe in the early days of the war, and gave Americans a sense that Europeans really cared about the outcome of this war. John Bright, a radical Quaker member of Parliament in Britain, actually a cotton mill owner, who by his material interests should have been on the side of the South, but by his convictions, democratic convictions, he saw in America a friend of his cause of reform to expand the vote in England. And he spoke also at the time of the Trent Crisis and said that this is no time to turn against America. We're a transatlantic nation. We are one people, and that this problem of slavery was one that we visited upon our colonies, and we must stand behind them now. Numerous others were enlisted in the Union cause. Now, the South came in a little bit later. They began the war with a kind of arrogant idea that Europe would come to us, They need our cotton. We will help to create this cotton famine, and they'll come begging to us. They didn't like the idea, because they were an unrecognized nation, that their diplomats were not received formally. And Jefferson Davis complained that they had to be kind of waiting in back rooms like servants, like supplicants, trying to be recognized, and would not be invited to the courts of Europe, but instead they met with them secretly in vacation places or in their private residence. One of the most brilliant Confederate public diplomatists was Henry Hoates, Swiss-born, Jesuit-educated. He came to Mobile as a young man and got caught up in the Southern cause, first as a journalist and also as a collaborator with Josiah Nott, an anthropologist, a pioneering anthropologist who was devising racial theories about polygenesis, that is, to explain the differences between blacks and whites by arguing that blacks were a separate species, a pre-Adamite species. Nott and Henry Hoates collaborated together in translating the work of Arthur Gobineau, whose essay on the inequality of the human races was the pioneering work in what we would later know as scientific racism, and was one of the great inspirations, to Adolf Hitler. He's a very important figure in this racism. Hoates had the idea that instead of apologizing for slavery as some barbaric relic of the past, to put it forward as a kind of modern model for a new age of imperialism, as Britain and France and other European countries were descending into colonization of Asia and Africa. One of the striking features of Hoates and the Confederate propaganda or public diplomacy campaign was that they tended not to trust local authors. For one thing, they were aware that most European liberals were opposed to slavery. They had ended slavery in Britain and France, and they did see it as a barbaric relic of the past. John Slidell, the envoy to Paris, said, "Whenever people bring up the subject of slavery, I change the conversation to a more agreeable topic. People have made up their minds about slavery, and there's no sense in trying to persuade them." But Hoates and others in the Confederate public diplomacy operation instead did try to, quote, educate Europe on the benign character of Southern slavery as opposed to the more violent forms and brutal forms of slavery in the Caribbean. Another was Edwin De Leon, who was the self-styled ambassador to public opinion for the Confederacy. De Leon was a fast-talking journalist and former diplomat who grew up in Columbia, South Carolina. He came from a Sephardic Jewish family, very prominent in South Carolina. He'd gone to the College of South Carolina, my employer. He was appointed to a diplomatic post in Alexandria, Egypt, and when he learned of secession, rushed to Europe and loaned his pen to the cause of Confederate diplomacy in a kind of unofficial way. He realized that Europe was not going to come. After the Trent Crisis had failed to ignite war, he realized that the South would have to work for recognition and that they would have to cultivate public opinion and they would have to make their case to the public and not just wait for the government to come. He went back to Richmond and sweet-talked Jefferson Davis. He just charmed Jefferson Davis, gave him a gift of an Arabian horse, and told him that he was the leader of this enlightened government and that all these old fogies didn't know what they were doing, and that what he needed to do was to invest in a bright young man like Edwin De Leon. And he came back to Europe with a purse of $25,000 that he could spend in any way he wanted to manage the public mind, or to put the public mind in the right direction, as he put it. One of the first things he did when he got back in the summer of '62 was to publish a 32-page pamphlet in French not very good French as it turned out, on the truth about the Confederate States of America. One of the main points that he made, and it really did score in Europe, was that the South is determined to become independent. They're not going to fold. They're not going to quit. You can take New Orleans. New Orleans now had fallen, but it just strengthened their resolve not to give up. And furthermore, he wanted to educate them about the benign nature of Southern slavery. In the South, slavery, he argued, was a domestic institution. Blacks were happy. They didn't want to be taken off by these venal Yankees, hypocritical and racist, and they didn't want to, they were loyal to their masters. But the most novel aspect of De Leon's pamphlet, and one of the new ploys in Southern public diplomacy, was to argue that the South was Latin, that they were part of this kind of Latin revival that Napoleon III was dreaming about. They were not like the Puritans of the North. They were Anglo-Normans who had come from the Cavalier stock in England, and large numbers of the Southerners were, of course, from Louisiana. Slidell, actually a New Yorker, had married into a Louisiana family, spoke French fluently, and he was also persuading Napoleon III that we are part of the Latin race. South Carolina Huguenots also descended from the French, of course. And in temperament as well as in blood, the South had much more affinity with the Latin race than they did with these fanatical Puritans who had now taken over in the North. So the Confederacy began during the war to shift over to the right, to align itself with Napoleon III. They offered to make common enemies against the United States, that they would fight with the French against the United States, that Napoleon's plans for Mexico depended on Confederate success, and they also curried favor with Pope Pius IX, the Vatican, as a way of trying to align themselves with the Catholic Church and to discourage Irish immigrants who were coming over, they thought, mistakenly thinking that they were coming to the land of freedom and being dragooned into the Union Army. Conversely, the Union began to gravitate to the left, to appeal to liberal Europe. They began to realize that the governments of Europe, dominated by aristocratic governing classes, wanted them to fail. And at best, they would stay neutral, and at worst, they would lean toward the Confederacy, and they were constantly threatening to intervene, usually by offering mediation, which would lead to recognition of the South. The Union encased the slavery issue in this broader issue of the Republican experiment. Republicanism was based on the idea of human equality and human volition to elect their own government. Aristocratic privilege and slavery were both rooted in the concept of fixed, inherited status, whereas the Republican idea was the ideal of equality and of opportunity. No one really knew whether any of this public diplomacy and soft power tactics, these appeals were working. Newspapers were reprinting Lincoln's speeches and letters, and there was a lot of ink out there telling the world that the Union was fighting for the cause of all nations, for human liberty and equality, as well as the emancipation of the slaves. But there were no polls. There were no ways to take the pulse of the public mind. Historians often confuse public opinion, public sentiment with what they read in newspapers. Those were efforts to try to mold or reflect and appeal to public opinion. And then the end of the war came, and Lincoln's death, just a few days after news of Lee's surrender. And U.S. diplomats all across Europe and Latin America witnessed something that they just had, that just astonished them. People came out of their shops and out of their homes into the streets to mix, to share news. Newspapers were sold like crazy. Special editions were printed about Lincoln's death. Stock markets were closed in London and elsewhere. In South America, the news didn't arrive in Chile until sometime in June, but it could have been yesterday that the assassination took place for the emotion that was shown by people who didn't speak their language, the English language. And the US diplomat there had no idea that they cared as much as they apparently did about Lincoln and the American Union, came before the American legation there in Valparaiso with tears streaming down their eyes. Mortuary salvos were fired every half hour, flags at half-mast. In Paris, in particular, which was a kind of hotbed of red republicanism, Masonic lodges, which were especially virulent in their red republicanism, draped their lodges in black crepe. Now, mind you, under Napoleon III, you could not have public meetings or public demonstrations. So this is a way of kind of showing the government, here's what we think of Lincoln. They considered him a Mason. He died like a Mason. They said he had at one time applied to become a Mason, but didn't become one. And they had funeral processions. And again, mortuary salvos. One night, soon after the news arrived, a mass of students poured out of Professor Laboulaye's lecture, which was supposed to be on Benjamin Franklin, but immediately became a eulogy to Lincoln. And they came out and gathered in the Latin Quarter at Pont Saint-Michel. Their idea was to have a mass march out the Champs-Élysées to the home of the new ambassador to the United States, from the United States, John Bigelow. And the police came out, swords drawn, broke up the crowd, arrested some of the students, and others scattered, made their way through the back streets, ran through the streets of Paris for 3 miles, came to Bigelow's house, found that cordoned off by police, and emboldened by their defiance, broke through the police cordon and came into Bigelow's house. This astonished diplomat, imagine a US diplomat with French students sweaty and tired coming into the house. They were there. One of them pulls out a paper from their coat and reads this beautiful, sympathetic statement of solidarity and sympathy for Lincoln, for America, for the great republic, and finishes with these "Vive Lincoln." And Bigelow answers in his very best French that he will send this letter to President Johnson and to Mrs. Lincoln and thanks them. That night, he wrote to William Seward, "I had no idea that Mr. Lincoln had such a hold upon the heart of the young gentleman of France." No one had any idea until that night, until that week, that summer, when people all over Europe and Latin America met in churches, in town halls, and then issued resolutions of sympathy. It was Bigelow's idea to gather them, to send them back to Washington, to have them translated and published and bound, and then sent to all of the governments of the world and to all of the organizations and individuals that had sent letters. It was a beautiful, ingenious exercise in public diplomacy and soft power, showing these governments, here's what your citizens think of Lincoln, of the Republican ideals. What they were seeing that summer was a rebirth of confidence and courage in the transatlantic Republican movement, from Mexico to France, from Britain to Argentina, everything in between. There were a whole series of Republican revolutions, emancipation movements, and successes scored for the Republican experiment. That cordon of slavery and empire that had surrounded the beleaguered United States in 1865 withered away. Russia sells Alaska. Britain sets up Canada as a self-governing dominion. Spain withdraws from Santo Domingo. Faces a Republican revolution in Cuba. France decides it's time to withdraw from Mexico, and Maximilian is left to face a firing squad of Mexican Republicans in 1867. Back in Britain and across Europe, thrones were shaken. Napoleon III, of course, was overthrown in 1870. The Spanish, against all expectations, had a Republican revolution in 1868 and sent Queen Isabella running into exile. And the British, never given to revolutions per se, reformed the suffrage, expanded the suffrage for British males, at least, greatly with the Second Reform Act of 1867. Edward Beasley, one of their leaders, noted that under a strain such as no aristocracy, no monarchy, no empire could have supported, Republican institutions have stood firm. It is we now who call upon the privileged classes to mark the result. In Paris, Eugene Pelletan, an ardent French Republican, noted, America is not only America, one place or one race more on the map. It is yet and especially the model school of liberty. If against all possibility it had perished, with it would fall a great experiment. Thank you.
We've got some time for questions, so if anyone would raise their hands, we'll get the microphone to you. If you'll wait till the microphone gets to you, please.
Good evening, and thank you very much for a very informative talk. Two influences I'd like to ask about. One would have been maybe limited to kind of a select few, and I'm talking about de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. But then there was something that was still fresh in the minds of a lot of Europeans when the Civil War started, and that was the various revolutions of 1848. Yeah. How did either or both of those figure into the way the public perceptions of the Civil War went? How did they figure in?
Good question. So de Tocqueville comes out with his tome, Democracy in America, in the 1830s. A lot of Americans read that as a kind of French realization that democracy is the wave of the future. In France and in Europe, that was a kind of terrifying message and one that they did not welcome. And they read that often as for its warning about the tyranny of the majority and the dangers of democracy. So de Tocqueville was put to use for conservative purposes often. The Revolution of 1848, of course, that was a story of what many hoped would be the ultimate failure of the Republican experiment in Europe. But each of those revolutions had failed, even in France, and especially in France, it had been betrayed by Napoleon III, which became an autocratic empire. So here it is now. Finally, the conservatives anyway, see the failure now of democracy and republicanism in the New World. And then they begin to see it rising up.
Yes, sir.
Leon wrote or writes the definitive history of foreigners in the Confederacy and the Union Army. She wrote it about, I think 5 decades ago. So are the foreigners from Europe coming to America to be on the winning side, or are they just coming over to get into a big fight?
Yeah. One of my most exciting discoveries was the role of the foreign legions, I call them, in one chapter. And I discovered that about 43% of the Union Army were immigrants and the sons of immigrants. Southerners often criticized them by saying that they were mercenaries and that they were being kind of paid to fight a war that the Yankees themselves wouldn't fight. And they were very critical of the efforts to recruit particularly Irish, but others in Europe, duping them into this war, this unholy war. And that was one of the reasons they wanted to enlist the Pope on their side. Most of the foreigners that I'm talking about were actually already there. Many of them had come over, that is already here in the United States. They'd come over since the famines and revolutions had failed in Europe in the late 1840s. But during the war itself, immigration almost shut down. And then here's another ingenious technique of Seward. He introduces the Homestead Act. I always thought of that as trying to get people to go out to Nebraska and build sod huts, but it was foreign policy too. It was a way of advertising. America's open for business. Wages are up. We can't recruit you as soldiers, but we need labor. And it was very effective in publicizing the need for labor. Only about 6% of the foreign-born lived in states that would become part of the Confederacy. And many of those places, like New Orleans, Memphis, large cities, they were concentrated there, and they fell to the Union early. There was a lot of controversy in the Confederacy about whether or not foreigners were citizens and therefore subject to the draft. And so they were very critical of the Union's dependence on these dregs from Europe and so on and so on, but they would have done anything to have them themselves. It made the difference. The Union could never have won without them.
It's that
Yes.
time in the semester when those of us who teach the survey have to be really careful to make sure we save some time for Reconstruction.
Yes.
Because if you end on this note of triumphalism, with the vindication of the Republic, the emancipation of the slaves, it leaves a very misleading impression. And so in terms of the way things did not at all work out,
Yes.
I've been thinking about this a lot as to whether, given what happened in Mexico in 1867, typically the losers in a war like this are not treated with lenience. Do you think the Mexicans might have had the right idea?
There was a lot of controversy about that, and a lot of people pleading with Juarez not to execute Maximilian. For one thing, not to make a martyr of him. There was talk after the execution among the European governing classes, particularly in Austria, but also in Belgium. Remember, Carlota was Belgian, Spain, and elsewhere, that they were going to get a multilateral expedition and come back and teach the Mexicans a lesson, but they thought better of it and didn't. This is a moment of great hope. In 1867 is kind of the high tide of this Republican reveille. Radical Reconstruction is really taking hold, and America is engaged in what looks like a kind of further experiment in now expanding citizenship and voting rights to former slaves. And so, we're now, I think, all very conscious of how the world looks at us as a kind of not being in the vanguard of liberty. But boy, in 1867 and for the next few years, we were. I always end my survey course in 1865. It's a lot of things would change. In 1870, is often the kind of a dividing line, the Franco-Prussian War, the rise of Germany in Europe, and so on. But I think what we have to, I'm not a Whiggish historian that looks at things as onward and upward progress, but at least for the moment, in 1870, 71, Cuba or Spain had now passed a free womb law that spelled the end of slavery in the Spanish Empire, and therefore Cuba and Puerto Rico. And Brazil followed in 1871 with the Rio Branco law. They didn't end slavery altogether until later in the 1880s, but it put slavery on the road to extinction. One Brazilian senator said at the end, "We didn't need a civil war to end slavery. The world laughing at us was enough. The family of nations scorning us was enough." And so whatever else happened or would happen in the future with Reconstruction and with imperialism in Europe, with the rise of scientific racism and all the other horrors ahead, slavery, African American slavery in the Western Hemisphere was dead. It was not going to come back. And monarchy had been repelled. It had been rejected. Democracy, government by the people, had shown that it was not going to perish from the earth, not anytime soon, anyway. So no mean feat, but not total triumph, I agree.
Any further questions? Got one more? Okay.
40 years ago, my text in grade school was Randall and Donald. Is that still relevant?
Oh, yeah, that's a golden oldie. I think that, well, wasn't Randall one of those that was kind of a revisionist who was saying that this was an unnecessary war, that there were natural limits to the extension of slavery? And if you're just patient, you know, instead of fighting this battle over secession, that slavery would die a natural death. And I don't think any historian accepts that. The Confederacy wasn't just about secession. It was about creating a slave nation that was going to now be independent of the Union and would expand into Latin America, and to create a tropical empire or to expand to the West. And this Civil War and the international alliances that it offered with France, it opened up all kinds of possibilities.
Don, I want to thank you very much. Before we move to the book signing, I want to make a special introduction, and I'm going to get myself in trouble because I probably won't get all the words right. But my good friend, Dr. Angie Maxwell, is here. She has delivered a lecture here at the Clinton School. Her lecture became a book, The Indicted South. It just won the V.O. Key Award for the best book on Southern politics. So, Dr. Maxwell, welcome back. And you are in an 1899 restored passenger train station that is now the oldest LEED certified building in Arkansas. So welcome to the Clinton School. Don, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Come enjoy his book and let him sign it for you. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Don Doyle.